Hey there. Tonight we begin in a basement. Not a temple, not a palace, not a sunken island, but a museum basement where a small clay tablet sat for years inside an archival box, quiet as a sleeping thing, while its meaning waited. On its surface were 6 columns of wedge-shaped marks, baked hard by an ancient fire. And inside those marks was a story about 5 cities before the flood. Gods walking among human beings, kingship lowered from heaven, and one warned survivor carrying memory through the dark water. And the unsettling part is this. Far away in another language and another age, Plato preserved a second memory of a lost world, an island realm with God, descended rulers, ordered laws, abundance, pride, judgment, and destruction by water. If those old stories are your kind of night thought, like the video, subscribe, and stay with me. Draw the room a little quieter around you. Let the lights soften. Let your breathing loosen just enough that the day begins to fall back. We are going somewhere old now, somewhere damp and half-remembered, to ask whether 2 civilizations might have been describing the same absence from opposite shores of time. The room where the tablet rested was probably colder than people expect. Museum basements always seem to hold a special kind of stillness, the stillness of careful forgetting. Steel shelving, gray boxes, inventory labels, foam cradles, numbers written in a handwriting that once belonged to someone certain this object mattered, though perhaps not yet certain how. The clay fragment itself was not dramatic at first glance. Reddish-brown, roughly the size of a book, broken at the edges, its lower portion surviving while the rest had vanished into centuries of ruin. Yet if you were standing there with me, and if one of the drawers slid open and the box lifted, I think the first thing you would notice would be how small the vessel of memory really was. Human beings like to imagine the past in grand architecture, but so much of it survives in handfuls. This tablet, catalogued by modern scholars and known in collections by one of those museum labels that sounds more like a storage shelf than a doorway into deep time, preserves one of the oldest written flood memories we possess. The story on it is older than the copy itself. That matters. The hand that pressed these wedge signs into wet clay was already repeating something ancient. A scribe copied from an older version, which had likely been copied from another, and another before that, until eventually the chain disappears into oral tradition, into recitation, into nights when the flood story may have been spoken aloud long before it was ever written down. That is one of the first reasons the text feels so haunting. It does not simply tell of survival. It is survival. Before the Great Flood, the text says, there were cities. Not one wandering camp. Not a vague paradise with no streets or names. Cities. Centers of order. Places where the divine and human worlds touched closely enough that the old memory does not treat civilization as a human invention at all. It treats it as an inheritance. Kingship had already been lowered from heaven. Agriculture, writing, the measuring of time, the arts that make a people settled and dangerous and memorable. All of that belonged to the world before the waters rose. Then the gods held council. A decision was made. Humanity would be swept away. One god objected. He warned a king. A vessel was built. Rain and flood came over the world. The survivor emerged, offered sacrifice, and through him, continuity was allowed to continue. If that sounds familiar, it should. You hear cousins of it in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in Atrahasis, in the Hebrew Bible, in later Mediterranean traditions that shift the details but keep the bones. The bones are always recognizable. A world before this one. Divine displeasure. Water as judgment. One surviving line of memory. And honestly, I have always found it strange that people hear this and think first of fantasy rather than memory. Not literal memory, perhaps. Not a perfect record of dates and coastlines and population counts. But memory all the same. The memory of land lost so completely that it had to be carried forward in myth because the ground itself was gone. This is where Plato enters the room. He arrives late in the chain, much later than the clay tablet, but he brings his own preserved wound. In his dialogue, through the voice of Egyptian priests speaking to Solon, there appears the story of Atlantis, a great island civilization, organized, fertile, technologically sophisticated in the old narrative sense, ruled by 10 kings descended from a god. It flourished. It became proud. The gods judged it. In a single day and night of catastrophe, it vanished beneath the sea. What remained was not the island itself, not its harbors or walls or temples, but memory preserved in sacred records and passed from culture to culture like an ember that never fully goes out. Now, I want to be careful here, because the source itself is careful in its own way. The Sumerian texts do not name Atlantis. Plato does not name the Anunnaki. No clay tablet says plainly that these are the same story. There is no neat, cinematic reveal where two broken tablets click together and the mystery dissolves. That is not how the ancient world tends to work. It works through echoes, through repeated structure, through inconvenient parallels that sit in different archives wearing different names. And the parallel here is difficult to ignore. In both traditions, there is a sophisticated world before catastrophe. In both, divine ancestry or divine governance matters. In both, water erases what once stood. In both, what survives is not the world itself, but its transmitted memory. That does not prove identity, but it creates an atmosphere, and atmosphere is sometimes the first honest stage of knowledge. Before proof comes pressure. Before certainty comes pattern. Imagine for a moment the old Mesopotamian scribe and the later Greek philosopher as two men in separate rooms, thousands of years apart, both leaning over inherited material that insists the present is not the beginning. That is the true discomfort under both texts. Modern people like beginnings. We like stories where civilization rises, improves, and flatters our timeline. These older traditions are less kind. They suggest that whatever we are, we came after a break, after a loss, after a world closer to God's, or at least closer to forms of order later generations could only imitate. The tablet in the museum basement does not try to prove itself. That may be why it remains so persuasive. Its marks are dry. Its style is administrative even inside myth. Ancient Mesopotamia had a talent for making cosmic events feel like items in a ledger. Before the flood, cities, a council, a warning, a veshel. After the flood, sacrifice, continuity. This dryness matters because it makes the story less theatrical and more like institutional memory. Not a campfire tale told to frighten children, but something copied because it was considered necessary. And perhaps that is the right word for all of this. Necessary. The Sumerians did not preserve the flood because water is entertaining. They preserved it because the flood explained the world they believed they inhabited. A world where kingship was inherited, not invented. Where knowledge was given, not discovered. Where the first city sat at the edge of water and the gods who governed it remembered a time before the deluge. Plato, too, needed Atlantis because he needed a lost counterpart, a drowned exemplar, a warning about order and corruption and the terrible fragility of human greatness before forces larger than any empire. If you were sitting here with me by a real fire instead of this imagined one, I think this is where I would pause and let that settle. Not the loud modern version of Atlantis. Not crystals and nonsense and people making documentaries with very serious music. Just the old severe version. A world before ours. Ordered. Sophisticated. Destroyed by water. Remembered imperfectly. That is enough to trouble the room. The deeper we go, the more the setting begins to matter. Because these stories are not floating abstractions. They began somewhere, on actual land, near actual water, among people whose coastlines were not the coastlines we know now. This is the next question, and in some ways the most important one. Not whether Atlantis existed in the exact shape Plato describes, not whether the Anunnaki can be translated into some modern obsession, but what happened to the land where these memories began? What landscape was altered so severely that a people later sitting in cities like Eridu and Shurapak would remember a world before the flood as though it had once stood just beyond reach? The answer leads away from the museum and down into geography, into the Persian Gulf, into a body of water so ordinary on a map that it is easy to forget how recently, in geological terms, it became a sea at all. That is where the story darkens and clarifies at the same time. Because beneath those warm, shallow waters, there once lay a river valley, broad and habitable, carrying joined rivers toward the ocean. During the last glacial maximum, with sea levels far lower than now, the Gulf Basin was land. Not metaphorically, literally land. A valley floor, a plain, a place where people could live, hunt, fish, settle, travel, perhaps even begin building the earliest frameworks of the organized life that later Mesopotamia would remember as a gift from before catastrophe. I have always found that moment in the argument quietly devastating. The land is not mythical. The drowned world is geologically possible before it becomes mythically meaningful. If sea levels rose, and they did, if the valley flooded, and it did, if people lived there, which seems likely, then there were human beings who watched their known world retreat underwater generation by generation. Not perhaps in one single cinematic day and night, though oral tradition can compress centuries into a storm, but in a long sequence of losses: coastline moving, camps abandoned, paths broken, settlements cut off, high ground becoming island, memory learning to speak in the language of divine displeasure, because plain speech was not enough for what had happened. Soon we will go there fully, into the drowned valley, the shallow gulf, the buried channels, the slow inundation that may lie beneath all later telling. But before we leave this first chamber, I want to hold one image a little longer. The clay tablet back in its archival cradle, the marks on it still sharp enough to read. A broken fragment of fired earth naming a flood, a survivor, a world before this one, and the continuation of life through transmitted memory. It survived because a city burned. It remained because destruction preserved it. There is something almost too perfect in that. The flood story outlived the flood because fire saved the clay. And now the waters themselves are waiting. The museum room falls away. The steel shelves and labels recede. In their place comes a broad old plain, not yet drowned, cut by rivers, edged by higher ground, carrying the earliest possible shape of this memory in its soil. If the tablet is the voice, the landscape beneath the gulf is the body that voice still belongs to. If you drained the Persian Gulf, not with magic, not with some dramatic gesture from myth, but slowly and honestly, meter by meter, what would appear first would not look legendary. That is important. The first thing would be mud, channels, salt floods, ancient sediment laid down in patterns too old for the eye to read quickly. Then, farther down, the shape of the old world would begin to emerge. A broad basin, river courses winding across what is now seabed. A valley where the Tigris and Euphrates once joined and flowed southeast toward the open ocean. During the last glacial maximum, when so much of the world's water was locked away in ice, that basin was not sea. It was land, a habitable plain, a lost geography waiting under warm water and silt. The modern Gulf is shallow in much of its northern half, and that simple fact does much of the heavy work in this argument. In many areas, the depth is modest enough that you can feel, even from maps, how recently the ocean claimed it. Sea levels during the last ice age stood far lower than today, over 100 meters lower by some estimates. That changes everything. Coastlines move outward. River valleys lengthen. Places that later cultures will treat as primordial or drowned or sacred exist first as ordinary terrain, which may be the saddest thing about lost worlds. They begin as homes, not symbols. Geologists have traced ancient channels beneath the Gulf floor. Core samples preserve terrestrial sediments where marine deposits lie above them now. The evidence is not dreamy. It is blunt. 15,000 years ago, and earlier still, large portions of what is now seabed were dry. Rivers crossed it. People could have crossed it too. They likely did. We have strong indirect evidence for human occupation around the margins of the basin, and enough archaeological hints to make the old valley look less like a fantasy setting and more like a missing chapter. Imagine standing on that plain before the waters came far enough in. The air would have been different from the desert severity people associate with the region now. There would have been river moisture, reed growth, fish, birds, fresh water, marsh edges, game, plant resources, all the things that make a difficult landscape become a livable one. Not an Eden, perhaps. Real places never are. But a place worth settling, worth returning to, worth remembering after it was gone. One modern geological model after another returns to the same broad picture. Sea levels rose between roughly 15,000 and 6,000 years ago, not always steadily, sometimes in dramatic pulses. Meltwater from collapsing ice sheets entered the oceans. The Gulf Basin filled from the south. Shorelines retreated northward over generations. What had once been a river valley became an inlet, then a sea. I think the generational scale is what matters most for a sleep story, because it helps the mind feel the human weight of it. Not one theatrical disaster out of nowhere, but grandfathers pointing at where the shoreline used to be. Parents moving camps. Children growing up in a world slightly smaller than the one their elders described. Then, after enough such losses, memory compresses all those decades or centuries into one sentence. The flood swept over. Some scholars prefer caution here, and they are right to do so. We do not have a neatly excavated antediluvian city rising from the Gulf floor with a plaque that says "Lost Cradle of Civilization." Underwater archaeology in the region is limited. Sediment hides what it protects. Politics complicates research. Marine erosion does the rest. What survives most clearly are edges and implications. Coastal sites that were once inland, human occupation at the margins, geological certainty about the drowning, archaeological uncertainty about the centers now lost. It is exactly the kind of gap where myth becomes powerful, because myth is often what human beings build when the physical evidence has slipped underwater but the wound remains. There is something almost unnerving about how well this matches the emotional structure of the Sumerian tradition. The texts preserve not merely a flood, but a world before the flood, a world with cities, kingship, order, and divine proximity. Then a break, then a diminished continuation. That is precisely the sort of narrative one would expect from a culture that arose beside a recently stabilized sea which had swallowed the lands of earlier settlement. The first historical city does not have to be literally submerged to inherit the memory of submergence. It only needs to stand close enough to the drowned geography that the old absence remains culturally active. That brings us toward Eridu, though not fully there yet. Before the first city receives its proper share of attention, the landscape itself deserves a little more time. Think about the practical consequences of a long inundation. Fresh water sources altered, familiar routes lost, hunting grounds gone, burial places submerged, sacred sites abandoned or transformed, high ground becoming refuge, then island. Knowledge of where water flowed and when the sea retreated becoming precious enough to pass down carefully. In such a world, survival would depend not only on movement but on memory. People who remembered the deeper channels, the safer ridges, the seasonal changes, the relation between river and sea would carry an advantage so great it might later feel divine. Honestly, I have always found that one of the most plausible roots of the old stories, not gods descending in some crude modern way, but teachers, survivors, elders whose knowledge of land and water outlasted the catastrophe and became mythologized over time. The Sumerians call that knowledge a gift from the gods. Plato makes it an inheritance from divine kings. Both may be describing what cultures often do when expertise arrives from a past no longer fully understood. They raise it upward. They call it holy because they can feel that it came from before them and because it was necessary. There is also the emotional geography of drowned places. Human beings do not lose land neutrally. We attach story to it even when it still stands. Once it is gone, story becomes the only stable ground left. A hill that becomes an island acquires significance. A spring that remains useful after the sea rises becomes sacred. A settlement founded at the edge of the new coastline claims primacy not only because it is old, but because it stands nearest to what was lost. That helps explain why the first city in Sumerian memory, Eridu, matters so much. It is not merely old. It is coastal at the right time, aquatic in symbolism, associated with Enki, Lord of wisdom and fresh water, positioned at the seam between the drowned and the surviving world. But before we step into Eridu itself, there is one more geological melancholy worth dwelling with. The sea does not destroy memory all at once. It destroys evidence, which is more frustrating. That broad old valley now lies under layers of water and sediment. If there were villages there, if there were shrine sites, if there were early irrigation attempts, if there were communities clever enough to organize themselves around the fresh waters of that lost plain, the physical trace is buried, broken, or inaccessible. This is why myth gains such unusual dignity in discussions like this. Not because myth is automatically true, but because sometimes it is what remains when the coastline has erased the archive. You know that feeling when you return to a place after many years and find not the place itself, but some faint alignment, one wall still standing, one tree line, one smell after rain that tells you where you are. Flood memory can work like that culturally. The civilization that later writes the story no longer possesses the drowned world. It possesses hints. A recently formed shoreline, sacred prestige clustering at certain cities, a pattern of oral tales about a great deluge and knowledge from before it. The land itself has become partial, and the story follows. This is why the source's question is more compelling than the word Atlantis alone. Atlantis can become noisy very quickly in modern mouths. But the drowned Gulf Valley is stubbornly real in a way people find harder to dismiss. Once you accept that the land existed and flooded, the old Mesopotamian memory of a world before the waters begins to feel less like decorative mythology and more like cultural compression. The sea rose. Communities shifted. Earlier centers vanished. New cities arose at the edge of a transformed environment. Over time, theology did what theology does. It interpreted the environmental rupture as divine judgment, divine withdrawal, divine preservation of selected knowledge. Plato's timeline hovers here like a strange echo. His priests place Atlantis far back, around the age when post-glacial flooding would indeed still be reshaping coastlines in major ways. The match is not exact enough to satisfy a courtroom. It does not need to be. The match is atmospheric, chronological in a loose but troubling way, enough to keep the possibility alive that later Mediterranean traditions and old Mesopotamian ones were both orbiting the same class of remembered catastrophe. A world before current coastlines, a world lost to water, a world remembered as more ordered, or at least more complete, than the diminished world that followed. If you were standing here with me in imagination over the modern Gulf, perhaps from some high vantage where the water looks calm and almost deceptively ordinary, I think I would ask you to picture not an island empire first, but a patient drowning, river channels disappearing under advancing salt water, camps moved inland, high ground chosen more carefully, certain places becoming impossible to revisit except in speech. There is nothing theatrical about it from moment to moment. That may be why later cultures made it theatrical in story. A single flood, a divine council, a chosen survivor. Myth has to compress what lived experience stretches across generations. And yet compression does not mean falsehood. It means form. Form suitable for carrying a memory far longer than raw chronology could survive. The flood becomes the flood. The antediluvian world becomes one coherent before. The drowned plain becomes a moral and sacred absence. The survivors become culture heroes, or priests, or dissenting gods speaking through walls. That is how memory becomes durable enough to cross thousands of years and still be legible on clay. Soon enough, we have to walk onto the shore of the first city. We have to let Eridu rise in the marsh light. Let Enki's waters gather under the temple. Let the oldest urban memory in Mesopotamia stand at the edge of the sea that had recently swallowed the plain. That is where the geography becomes religion, where drowned land becomes sacred inheritance, where the first city may have been less an absolute beginning than the first survivor important enough to write itself down. For now, though, let the valley remain beneath the water, broad, silent, lost, but not erased entirely. The seabed still carries the shape of its channels. Sediment still keeps the patient outline of where rivers once ran. And above it, later civilizations built stories strong enough to float where settlements could not. In the next movement, one of those stories becomes a city with a name. Eridu, the first city, or perhaps the first city after memory, had already learned what drowning meant. Eridu does not rise out of the story like a triumph. It rises like a memory trying very hard to become a place again. That is the feeling I keep returning to when I think about the first city of Sumer. Not the beginning of civilization in the neat modern sense, not a bright flag planted into empty history, but something more delicate and more haunting. A settlement built at the lip of an altered world, where river, marsh, fresh water, salt water, and inherited memory all met in one unstable, sacred edge. If you could stand there in the earliest light, before the day fully declared itself, you would not see a stone city like the ones people carry around in their imagination when they hear the word ancient. You would see mud brick, reed beds, wet earth dark underfoot, a horizon still carrying the softness of water, air that smelled not only of silt and fish and growing things, but of something just on the edge between river and sea. Eridu belonged to that threshold. It was old enough to feel primordial even to the people who came after it, and watery enough that its entire sacred mood seems shaped by proximity to a lost shoreline. Archaeology gives us one version of Eridu. Myth gives us another. The archaeology says that Eridu was among the earliest major settlements in southern Mesopotamia, rooted in the Ubaid period, developing over long spans of time, growing where marshland and coast once made life possible in difficult but fertile ways. The mythology says something more severe and more beautiful. It says Eridu was the first city after kingship came down, the first house of ordered life, the first place where something divine chose to settle among human beings and organize the world. Those two versions are not enemies. In fact, they sit together more comfortably than people often think. Because once you accept the possibility that the Persian Gulf basin had only recently drowned into something closer to its historical form, Eridu begins to look exactly like the sort of place where a civilization would root itself while preserving memory of something older. Not old enough to be the first settlement ever. Old enough to be the first survivor that mattered. I have always found that distinction important. The first city in memory is often not the literal first place where people built houses. It is the first place after catastrophe where order becomes visible again. That is why Enki belongs here. Not as decoration, not as one more god, placed into a civic pantheon, because ancient people liked assigning supernatural names to practical concerns, but as the right presence for this geography. Enki is lord of the sweet waters below the earth, of hidden sources, of cleverness, of craft, of measured intelligence, of those forms of knowledge that feel both practical and slightly secret. His temple at Eridu, the Abzu, was not simply a house for a god. It was a house for the deep, for the fresh water beneath and beneath and beneath, the concealed life of the world on which visible life depends. Imagine a priest walking into that temple before dawn. The floor cool under bare feet or thin sandals. The air inside stiller than the marsh outside, but never dry, because this is a house that remembers water. The walls smell faintly of clay and smoke and old offerings. Somewhere below the level of sight, below brick and threshold, is the imagination of the Abzu, the hidden water beneath the earth from which rivers and fertility and wisdom all ultimately emerge. The priest does not need modern geology to feel what that means. He lives at the edge of a recently changed world. He knows that land can vanish. He knows that water gives and water takes. A god of hidden fresh water is not a metaphor in such a place. He is stability. Some scholars argue that Eridu's watery symbolism grew from very practical environmental realities. And I think that is almost certainly right. Others push further and suggest that its extraordinary prestige and later Sumerian memory hints that the city inherited sacred weight from older coastal or riverine traditions, perhaps even from communities now lost beneath the Gulf. We cannot prove that cleanly. The underwater record remains too quiet, but the mood fits with unsettling grace. A settlement at the edge of a drowned landscape becoming the first remembered city of a post-flood civilization. That is not proof. It is resonance, and resonance matters. There is also the strange tension at the center of Eridu's status. On the one hand, it is remembered as the first city. On the other, the old traditions say kingship existed before the flood, and that there were cities before the flood too. That means Eridu stands in a delicate place. It is first, but also not first. Origin, but also inheritor. It is the first visible lamp after a darkness, not necessarily the first flame ever lit. You know that feeling when you move into a house built on older foundations, and even if you do not know the names of the previous people who lived there, you can feel that the rooms were arranged by someone before you. Eridu feels like that on a civilizational scale. It is a city living on the edge of prior arrangement. The first place after loss where the inherited order becomes habitable again. That is part of why the marshes matter so much in imagining it. Marshes are in between lands. They keep traces. They preserve and erase with equal patience. Reed beds whisper. Mud remembers prints only until the next water rise. Fish and birds make abundance feel temporary and cyclical rather than fixed. A city built there would grow up with a very different emotional logic from one planted high and dry in stone country. It would feel the world moving under it, breathing under it, changing. Now, step a little farther into the sacred architecture itself. Excavations at Eridu revealed multiple temple levels, built one above another, each phase renewing the site rather than abandoning it. A modest shrine becomes a larger shrine. Another rises above that. Then another. The sequence is one of the most moving things in early Mesopotamian archaeology, because it shows continuity in the act of building. A place chosen, marked, rechosen, preserved through renewal. Again, not the mood of invention from nothing, but of fidelity to an old point. Honestly, I have always found temple sequences like that more persuasive than grand claims. One level alone can be accident. Many levels on the same sacred point begin to look like obedience. And obedience is a useful word for Eridu. The city obeys water. It obeys inherited sacred geography. It obeys the memory that this edge between land and watery deep matters more than other edges. When later traditions say that the Abzu is here, that Enki resides here, that wisdom and civilization issue from this place, they may be placing theology over environment, but they are doing so with remarkable precision. The environment was always speaking first. That theological precision becomes even more intriguing once we bring the drowned gulf back into the room. A city associated with the hidden deep, founded near former coasts and marshes, rising after the inundation of an older basin, and then remembered as first. The possibility emerges almost on its own. Eridu may not have been the first place where humans in the region became settled and organized. It may have been the first post-catastrophe place where the surviving system was formalized strongly enough to endure in writing. In that sense, the title First City becomes less biological and more constitutional. The world before Eridu may already have contained villages, roots, shrines, fisheries, ritual places, maybe even early hydraulic knowledge among communities on the Gulf Plain. But if that world was progressively swallowed by rising water, then its memory would need a new anchor. Eridu could become that anchor. The first city because it was the first city that still existed above the altered coastline. The first city because the new order needed a beginning it could point to. The first city because cultural memory likes thresholds, and Eridu sat at exactly the right one. The smell of such a place lingers in the imagination. Wet clay drying in sun. Reed matting. Bitumen. Fish. Salt on air in certain seasons. Silt after flooding. The faint sweetness of marsh growth where fresh water resists the sea. A city made of such materials is never entirely separate from the landscape around it. It breathes with it. Shrines crack if moisture changes. Walls require repair. Boats matter. Channels matter. The hidden behavior of water matters. No wonder wisdom in such a place belongs to a water god. And wisdom here is not abstract. It means knowing where to cut channels, how to build in mud, how to keep a wall standing, how to interpret the behavior of water, how to organize labor, how to preserve food, how to speak to gods who seem always close to the question of inundation. This is why Enki is so compelling in the old traditions. He is not only sacred, he is useful in exactly the ways a people living after environmental transformation would find indispensable. If you were standing here with me beside this imaginary fire, I think I would say that Eridu is where myth becomes geography, and geography becomes theology, with almost no seam between them. A drowned basin behind it. Marsh and coast around it. Hidden waters below it. The first temple rising again and again in the same place. A divine patron of fresh water and intelligence. A later civilization looking back and saying, yes, there, that is where order began again. But if Eridu is the first visible anchor of the surviving world, then the next question comes naturally and with some weight. Who governed the older order that Eridu inherited? The texts answer with a name that has been distorted badly in the modern imagination, stretched into alien fantasies and internet noise. Yet in the earliest material remains much quieter and more serious than that. The Anunnaki. Not spacemen. Not a secret code. The Divine Council. The beings who hold order before and after the flood. The old powers under whom cities, kingship, and the arts of civilization are first arranged. That is where the story turns next. Away from the marsh edge for a moment and into the architecture of rule itself, into the pre-flood order remembered by Sumer not as chaos, but as governance already in place before humans ever learned to call their first surviving city first. The word Anunnaki has had a hard modern life. It has been pulled so far from its original setting that sometimes it feels less like a term from ancient Mesopotamia and more like a hostage note written by the internet. That is unfortunate, because in the oldest sources the Anunnaki are much more interesting than the loud modern versions. They are quieter, more administrative, more deeply woven into the old structure of civilization. They do not stride through the texts like science fiction invaders. They sit inside them like prior authority. If we are going to stay faithful to the source, and I want to, we have to clear that ground gently first. Mainstream Assyriology does not support the idea that the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrials in the way modern speculative writers have claimed. That interpretation is very late. very selective, and very eager in all the wrong ways. The ancient texts themselves place the Anunnaki within the divine order of Mesopotamian religion. They are a group of deities, or divine powers, associated with the Great Assembly, with decrees, with the ordering of destinies, with the structures that make civilization and cosmos legible. That is already strange enough. We do not need to dress them in chrome. And yet, once you let the older meaning return, something more subtle emerges. Because divine counsel is not a vague title. Councils decide. Councils assign. Councils distribute power, function, place, responsibility. In the Sumerian world, the Anunnaki belong precisely there. In the pre-human or superhuman level of administration from which the visible order is believed to descend. Kingship comes down from heaven. Cities are established. Ritual and law are anchored. The gods do not merely float above history. They govern its framework. That is why the modern alien reading, for all its noise, has remained parasitic on the older material. It senses that something is there, some memory of prior governors, and then misunderstands the register completely. The better question is not, were the Anunnaki visitors from another planet? The better question is why the earliest urban civilization remembered the origin of its own order as lying in a council of higher powers whose work had already been completed before the historical kings we can recover. Imagine a dim temple archive in southern Mesopotamia. Shells of tablets, dust on the ledges, a lamp trimmed low because oil is not to be wasted. A scribe traces a line with one finger as he reads a list of divine names, each tied to offices, vaters, decrees, fertility, storm, writing, rule. The room smells of clay, smoke, and old reed baskets. Outside, ordinary city life continues. Donkeys, boatmen, workers repairing some channel or gate. But inside the text, the world is held one level above all that. The Anunnaki are not daily life. They are its charter. I have always found that far more haunting than the noisy modern myths. A civilization believing its deepest institutions were inherited from a prior order of divine governors. That changes the emotional shape of everything. Human beings are not founders in that world. They are maintainers. The source handles this carefully, and it is right to do so. The Anunnaki are not presented as one single simple thing. In some texts, the term can point toward gods of the underworld. In others, toward the broader divine assembly. In others, toward those higher powers who participate in the ordering of destinies and the structure of the cosmos. The exact range shifts. Ancient religion is rarely tidy, but the persistent association with higher authority remains. The Anunnaki are the ones already in place when kingship arrives. This matters because the flood traditions do not present civilization as a human experiment interrupted by water. They present it as an inherited order interrupted by water. Before the flood, there were cities, kings, and divine proximity. After the flood, these things return, but changed, diminished, reissued. That is exactly the kind of narrative one would expect from a culture that feels itself to be the heir of something older and more complete. And this is where the idea of mythologized custodians becomes useful. I do not mean that the Anunnaki were secretly ordinary human administrators remembered incorrectly. That would be too flat. I mean that divine figures often preserve, in sacred form, the memory of actual categories of inherited knowledge and power: water control, agricultural timing, temple order, kingship, law, writing, ritual. In a civilization built out of canals and calendars, such things would not feel merely human. They would feel bestowed. The divine council becomes the perfect sacred expression of a world in which the most important skills seem to come from before. You know that feeling when you inherit a system so complex and so necessary that it seems impossible anyone like you could have invented it from scratch. A language, a city, a law code, a calendar. Ancient Mesopotamia lived inside that feeling. And the Anunnaki are one of the names it gave to the higher source of those systems. Enki, of course, sits near the heart of this. Lord of fresh water, wisdom, craft, cunning, life-preserving knowledge. He is the one who warns the flood hero in several traditions. He is the one who seems least willing to let destruction have the final word. If the world before the flood was governed by a higher order, Enki is the kind of figure you would expect to survive that order's transition into memory, because he belongs equally to technical skill and to sacred preservation. He is both theological and practical, a god of hidden water and hidden intelligence, the perfect patron for a civilization living after drowning. Enlil belongs here too, though more sternly. If Enki preserves, Enlil decrees. In many flood accounts, the decision to wipe out humanity is tied to this upper level of divine order, and the council's judgment gives the catastrophe its terrible formality. Again, not random weather, not chaos, police. The old Mesopotamian world imagines even its worst disasters as emerging from governance. That is the bureaucratic chill at the center of these stories. The world does not simply break. It is judged. Some scholars would argue, quite reasonably, that all of this is simply religion doing what religion does, sacralizing power, explaining catastrophe, embedding city life in divine hierarchy. They are not wrong. But the source asks us to stay with the extra pressure that remains once that explanation has done its work. Why does early Mesopotamia so often speak not as an inventor of civilization, but as an inheritor of a more ancient arrangement? Why are the highest civilizational forms already divine gifts? Why are the first visible cities already looking backward? That backward glance is where Atlantis and the Anunnaki begin to lean toward one another again. In Plato, Atlantis is not just prosperous. It is founded under divine patronage, ordered by laws inherited from Poseidon, ruled by a god-descended line. In Sumer, the pre-flood world is not just populated. It is organized under divine counsel, with kingship from heaven, cities already structured, and the arts of civilization already in place. Different cultures, different theological language, same unsettling mood. The best order lies behind the present. If you were sitting here with me and we had nothing but the sound of the fire and enough time to think slowly, I would say this may be the strongest bridge between the traditions. Not a direct naming, not a secret identical set of characters hidden under translation. A deeper, common structure. Both remember a prior world in which the human order stood closer to divine administration. Both place catastrophe between that world and the present. Both preserve continuity through chosen lines of memory. And that is why the Anunnaki matter. They are not merely interesting gods. They are the old Mesopotamian answer to the question of who governed the lost order before the flood broke. History into before and after. The 5 antediluvian cities do not stand alone. They stand under this higher assembly. Their impossible ages, their pre-flood kings, their dry appearance in the king list. All of it exists within a framework already set by the divine council. Human civilization in its visible form is always downstream from that prior arrangement. The emotional effect of this is easy to miss if read too quickly. Slow it down and it becomes very strange. Imagine being one of the later Sumerians. Centuries after the flood, memory has already hardened into tradition, copying lists of kings whose reign lengths no living person can make sense of, invoking deities whose authority is older than your city, offering rites in temples built on earlier temples, all while believing that the real beginning of order lies in a world no longer accessible. That is not triumph. It is custodianship tinged with loss. Honestly, I think that is why the modern noise around the Anunnaki bothers me. It throws away the melancholy, and the melancholy is where the truth of the old stories lives. The Anunnaki matter because they are the face of inherited authority in a civilization that feels late to its own beginnings. There is another quiet irony here. The more modern readers try to make the Anunnaki flashy, the less they resemble the texts. The older sources make them heavier, not louder, more solemn, more embedded in rule and fate and transmission. They are not the interruption of order. They are the upper register of order itself, which means that when the flood comes, what is lost is not only human life, it is closeness to that order. What survives after the flood is a diminished continuation, still legitimate, still sacred, but no longer the same. This prepares the ground for the next great structure in the story, the antediluvian king list itself. Because once the Anunnaki are understood as divine governors of the older world, the 5 cities before the flood stop sounding like random mythic place names and begin to look like remembered centers of an organized, sacred polity. 5 cities, 8 kings, long, impossible reigns. Then the flood. Then the return of kingship in a reduced world. It is one of the driest and eeriest transitions in ancient literature. Soon we have to stand before that list and read it slowly, name by name, city by city, letting its impossible numbers and calm tone do their work. But before we leave this chamber, I want to hold the image of the divine council a little longer. Not because it resolves the mystery, but because it deepens it properly. The Anunnaki are not the answer modern people were hoping to hear. They are the answer the old world actually gave. The lost order before the flood was real enough, in cultural memory, to require governors above humanity. And everything that comes after, Eridu, kingship, law, written remembrance, is shadowed by the knowledge that the greatest arrangement had already existed before the waters rose. Once the 5 cities have been named, and the impossible lengths of their kings have passed before the mind like shadows too large to belong to ordinary human life, the story begins to move seaward. Not away from Sumer, exactly, but outward from its marsh edges into a brighter and stranger place, a place that seems to stand half in memory and half in longing. Dilmun. The name itself feels like light on water. In the old texts, it is not introduced as a grim land of labor or dust. It appears as something cleaner than history usually allows. A place of purity. A place where the lion does not kill, where disease does not enter, where old age and complaint seem held at a respectful distance. A place where the gods linger with less tension in their voices. That is one reason the comparison with Atlantis becomes so difficult to ignore here. Not because Dilmun and Atlantis are identical. They are not. Their stories grow in different soils. Their surrounding literatures have different tempers. But both stand in the imagination as islands or island-like realms of special condition. Both lie near the beginning of things. Both feel more complete than the ordinary world that follows. And both arrive wrapped in the melancholy that comes whenever a civilization looks backward and says, "There was once a place where the order of life stood closer to perfection than it does now." The Mesopotamian texts speak of Dilmun with a brightness that almost startles after the mud and council chambers of flood tradition. In one mythic vision, it is the pure land where Enki and Ninhursag move through a world not yet burdened by ordinary suffering. The air there feels clean even through translation. The ground is fertile once the waters have been called forth. The place seems touched by a first morning quality, as if it stands not merely in geography, but in an earlier mood of creation. Honestly, I have always found that more haunting than any dramatic catastrophe scene. A place described too gently often leaves the deepest wound once it is gone. Now, there is also a historical Dilmun, and that matters very much. Archaeology places Bronze Age Dilmun most strongly in Bahrain and the nearby Gulf region, a trade network, an island center, a middle ground between Mesopotamia and lands farther east. Merchants knew it. Seafarers knew it. Goods moved through it. Burial mounds still rise there in stubborn numbers. So we are not dealing with a purely invented paradise floating free of the map. We are dealing with something more interesting. A real island landscape carrying a mythic name whose oldest resonance may reach farther back than the surviving trade records allow. Some scholars argue that this is exactly what happened. A historical Gulf island or island network inherited the sacred prestige of an older memory. A bright place already known in myth becomes attached to an actual center of exchange and ritual importance. That process is so human it almost feels inevitable. Names do not stay empty when cultures need them. They settle where memory can still breathe. Imagine Bahrain, or some earlier island high ground in the Gulf world, before the later historical layers fully hardened around it. Morning light scattering across shallow water. Salt in the air but fresh water somewhere near enough to keep settlement possible. Boats pulled onto shore. Mud brick, but ain't. Stone where stone can be had. Trade goods arriving. Birds wheeling. Graves accumulating on rises that stay dry. The island itself surrounded not by endless ocean in the modern imagination, but by a changing, living basin whose coastlines were still younger than the stories later told about them. It is not difficult to feel how such a place could absorb enormous symbolic weight. And that is where the Atlantis parallel starts to become gentle rather than loud. Atlantis, in Plato, is a remarkable island civilization marked by abundance, by special architecture, by divine ancestry, by ordered governance, and then by loss. Dilmun in Mesopotamian tradition is a remarkable island or island-associated realm marked by purity, divine intimacy, fertility, and a kind of preserved brightness. Neither text says, "We are the same place," but both are speaking in the language of idealized geography. Sacred islands often form when drowned landscapes leave only high points behind. The high ground becomes memory's altar. You know that feeling when a place seems to carry more meaning than its size or practical use alone would justify. An island can do that. A hill can do that. A spring can do that. Once the wider plain is gone, the surviving piece becomes disproportionately important. It gathers story like a garment. It gathers reverence. It starts standing for what was lost around it. The source also draws Utnapishtim into this atmosphere, and rightly so. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood survivor does not return to ordinary human society in a simple way. He ends in a place beyond common reach, often imagined as distant, remote, near the mouth of rivers, near the edge between human geography and the cosmic beyond. Some readers see this as a kind of mythic islanding. The survivor belongs to the same world as everyone else no longer. He dwells at its margin, in that peculiar zone where memory lives but cannot be fully re-entered. That is a beautiful and sad thing to notice. The survivor of catastrophe is often marooned, not only physically, but historically. He belongs to the drowned world and the new one at once, and therefore fully to neither. Now bring Dilmun and Utnapishtim together for a moment. A bright island of preserved purity. A flood survivor beyond ordinary roots. A gulf landscape where rising waters would have turned former uplands into true islands over time. The old myths do not have to be read as travel directions to feel the weight of this. They preserve the emotional geography of survival after inundation. High ground becomes sanctuary. Sanctuary becomes sacred. Sacred becomes paradise in retrospect. I have always found paradise stories a little suspicious in the best possible way, not because they are false, but because they so often preserve grief. A place does not become pure in memory unless the world around it has become more difficult. Dilmun glows because later Mesopotamia felt dimmer by comparison. Atlantis shines because the Greek presence stands outside whatever ordered fullness the story imagines. Paradise is often the language a civilization uses when it can no longer point directly to the lost landscape from which it inherited its oldest confidence. There are water themes everywhere in the Dilmun material, and they matter enormously. At first, the land lacks fresh water. Then Enki causes the waters to rise, and fertility appears. That is not just religious imagery. It is environmental logic raised to myth. In the Gulf world, fresh water was destiny. A spring, an upwelling, a channel, the right underground source. These made the difference between sacred place and unlivable shore. When texts turn such transformations into divine action, they are not leaving reality behind. They are intensifying the point where human dependence becomes reverence. Close your eyes and picture the first freshwater emergence on a bright island in a hot basin. Dry stone or salty margin. Then the hidden source. Water where there should have been too little. People gather. Animals gather. The smell changes. Green things become possible. The place becomes not just habitable but favored. In such a world, a god of fresh water is not abstract theology. He is the explanation for why life can remain on a piece of land surrounded by sea. And this is where Enki returns with unusual force. Eridu belongs to him. The Abzu belongs to him. Dilmun opens under his touch. The flood hero survives by a knowledge stream tied to his intervention. If there is one divine figure who binds together first city, hidden water, preserved wisdom, and post-catastrophe continuity, it is him. That coherence is not accidental. It reflects the whole emotional structure of southern Mesopotamian memory. Civilization survives not by brute force, but by the right relation to water and the intelligence required to live with it. Some scholars prefer to read Dilmun strictly as myth. Others emphasize the historical island and trade center, and the wiser position may be to let both stand. Ancient cultures often preserve memory by attaching mythic depth to real places. The historical Bahrain of later eras can be real. The paradisal Dilmun can be real in religious imagination. And both can descend from older layers of geographic memory rooted in the changing Gulf world. We do not need to flatten one into the other to feel the power of their overlap. If you were standing here with me in imagination on a bright Gulf island, with white glare on water and a low wind carrying salt and bird sound across burial mounds and anchorage points, I think you would feel the same strange doubleness. This is a place. This is also a memory vessel. It has become more than itself. That, to me, is one of the deepest bridges between Dilmun and Atlantis. Both are remembered as more than their geography. They are moralized, sanctified, brightened by distance. They stand at the border between history and longing. One can almost hear later generations speaking through them. There was once a place where divine order, water, fertility, and right relation still held together. We do not live there now. And then the story descends again. Because islands are only one side of the old water memory. The other side lies beneath. Beneath temple floors. Beneath marsh earth. Beneath the visible rivers. Beneath the world's skin. This is where the Abzu waits. Darker than Dilmun. Deeper, more inward. If Dilmun is the bright surviving height above the flood, the Abzu is the hidden reservoir below all things. And once we reach it, the question of lost knowledge becomes even sharper, because a civilization that remembers paradise on an island also remembers wisdom as something stored under the earth in the deep, freshwater dark. The Abzu is one of the most beautiful ideas the ancient world ever made practical. At first hearing, it sounds purely cosmic. The subterranean freshwater deep beneath the earth. The hidden source from which rivers and life emerge. The watery foundation of the world. but the longer one sits with southern Mesopotamia, the less the Abzu feels like a distant mythic abstraction, and the more it feels like theology grown directly out of lived hydrology. A people surrounded by marsh, river, seep, spring, shifting channels, and the constant negotiation between fresh and salt water would not imagine the hidden deep idly. They would imagine it because survival depended on what lay beneath what they could see. That is why Enki's house at Eridu is the Abzu, the house of the deep. Not the house of the mountain, not the house of the sun, the house of the hidden water below. When later readers encounter that title, there is a temptation to read it as ornament. But if you were standing in the temple precinct of Eridu in the half-light before dawn, with the marsh breathing nearby and the ground underfoot still holding yesterday's moisture, the word would feel less decorative and more exact. Beneath the visible world, there is a reservoir. Beneath every settlement, there is an unseen condition of survival. The temple names it because the city depends on it. Imagine descending into the coolness of a sacred space built to honor hidden water. The floor clay is firmer here. The air smells faintly of dampness even when the day outside is hard and bright. There is a hush that belongs specifically to enclosed places where people believe something below them is awake. Lamps burn. Reed baskets sit in corners. Offerings stand where they have been set carefully, and all the while the imagination of the place runs downward, not upward. This is unusual enough to matter. A civilization whose wisdom source lies below the earth rather than only above the sky is telling you something profound about what kind of world it inhabits. In Mesopotamian thought, the Abzu is not just water. It is potential. Life stored before emergence. Knowledge hidden before disclosure. Order held in reserve. Enki governs it because he governs the forms of intelligence that make a fragile civilization possible. Can a logic, craft, timing, language, fertility, the subtle arts of surviving in a difficult land. This is why the Abzu and Atlantis begin to lean toward one another in the source's argument. Not because Plato writes about the same divine terminology, but because both traditions preserve a memory of advanced civilization tied intimately to water control and hidden sources. Plato's Atlantis is full of springs, canals, harbors, baths, concentric waterworks, engineered movement of water through the city and its agricultural plain. That detail is often treated as background because the larger drama of destruction receives more attention. But honestly, I think the hydraulic detail is one of the most revealing parts of the whole story. Civilizations become impressive when they master water. They become sacred in memory when that mastery later looks lost. Mesopotamia understood this with unusual severity. A city there was never merely a cluster of buildings. It was a successful temporary argument against chaos conducted through channels, decus, basin management, seasonal timing, and labor organized at scale. Water had to be invited, directed, restrained, and interpreted. Too little, and the fields failed. Too much, and the fields drowned. Salt accumulated. Banks broke. Routes shifted. A people who lived inside that constant negotiation would naturally imagine true wisdom as hydraulic at its core. The Abzu is sacred because fresh water rightly ordered is the foundation of everything else. You know that feeling when a system is so fundamental you stop noticing it until it fails. Pipes in a city, electricity in a house, a bridge on the only road home. Ancient Mesopotamia lived much closer to the failure point than we do. They noticed water because they had to. The hidden source below the ground was not poetic excess. It was the invisible condition on which every visible order depended. This is where temple and engineering come very close to one another. A shrine at Eridu, named for the deep. Ritual language invoking hidden waters. Priests moving within symbolic frameworks that are also, in some indirect way, acknowledgments of a real hydrological world beneath and around them. The sacred and the technical are not enemies here. They are braided. That braid is one of the oldest signatures of civilization. Some readers of the old texts have tried to push the Abzu into the realm of pure mysticism, and there is certainly mysticism in it. Others have tried to reduce it to practical groundwater awareness, which is useful but too thin by itself. The stronger reading may be to hold both levels at once. The Abzu is cosmological fresh water. It is also the sanctified memory of water mastery. It is the religious form taken by the knowledge that civilization rests on hidden systems below the surface. If the source is right to place Atlantis near this thought, then what survives across both traditions is not a literal shared city plan, but a shared reverence for sophisticated relationship to water. Atlantis is remembered through concentric channels and springs. Sumer remembers divine wisdom as arising from the deep. Enki, lord of the Abzu, is less a sea god than a god of correct flow, correct emergence, correct use. I find that very persuasive. Lost civilization in ancient memory is often less about monuments than about system, about knowing how to live with forces that later generations only imitate badly. Picture a canal at night in southern Mesopotamia. Water moving black and quiet between cut banks. Reeds at the edge. Mud shining where a foot has recently slipped and recovered. Insects. A distant lamp. Somewhere beyond, the temple, and below the temple, the imagination of the Abzu, the hidden source from which all right order ultimately rises. Then picture Plato's Atlantis with its engineered rings of land and water, its inner and outer channels, its capacity to move people and goods through a landscape shaped deliberately by hydraulic understanding. Different language, same reverence. Civilized power is measured by whether water answers you. There is a reason flood memory and water mastery so often appear together. A people who remember catastrophic inundation do not stop thinking about water afterward. They intensify their thought. They sanctify the knowledge needed to survive it. The flood in myth becomes the great lesson. The Abzu becomes the hidden reserve of what must be understood if the post-flood world is to endure. I have always found that a little heartbreaking. Imagine inheriting only fragments of a much older competence. Enough to build cities. Yes. Enough to cut canals and raise temples and track seasons. But always with the sense that the true completeness lies behind you. In a world closer to divine administration. In a world before the break. That emotional structure explains so much of Mesopotamian culture. Restoration instead of invention. Inheritance instead of discovery. Sacred water instead of mere utility. The source leans gently toward the possibility that what later became theology may preserve a real civilizational memory of sophisticated hydraulic culture in the drowned Gulf world. I think that is a powerful idea, provided we do not turn it into cartoon certainty. We cannot excavate a sunken canal network and point at it triumphantly. Not yet, perhaps not ever. But we can say that the oldest surviving civilization in the region attached unusual sacred weight to hidden fresh water, water control, and wisdom descending from a god of the deep. That is not noise. That is signal. Some scholars will say, and again they are not wrong, that all early river civilizations sacralize water because water is life. Of course. But Mesopotamia does so with particular precision because its whole existence depends on managing a fine line between beneficial flow and annihilating flood, between life-giving river and sterile salt, between marsh abundance and destructive inundation. The Abzu is therefore not generic sacred water. It is the deep source of right water, ordered water, civilizing water. That nuance matters. If you were standing here with me in the imagined Abzu, the fire beside us replaced by a dim temple lamp, I think the strongest feeling would not be fear exactly. It would be depth. The sense that what sustains the visible city is hidden, below speech, below brick, below daily labor. Ancient people love to place wisdom in such hidden reservoirs because wisdom, in ordinary life too, often feels like that. Buried, difficult to access, life-saving once reached. And perhaps this is where Atlantis and the Anunnaki come closest without ever naming one another. Both point toward a lost or diminished world where the relation between humans, Vater, and higher order was more complete than it is in the present. Atlantis dramatizes that through island engineering and catastrophic sinking. Mesopotamia preserves it through divine counsel, flood rupture, first city memory, Dilmun's brightness, and the hidden intelligence of the Abzu. One is concentric and sea-ringed. The other is marsh-edged and temple-centered. Yet both are haunted by the same old possibility. There was once a civilizational knowledge of water so profound that later generations had to place it near the gods. Soon, the flood survivor must return. Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, the one who lives through the break and becomes a carrier of memory. Soon the Egyptian priests of Plato must return too, because the final part of this story belongs not to the drowned world itself, but to the people who remember it imperfectly afterward. But before we leave the deep, let the Abzu remain for one more breath beneath the city, beneath the temple, beneath the reeds, beneath every later archive. Hidden water, hidden knowledge, hidden continuity. The kind of thing a civilization knows it depends on, even when it can no longer see the full shape of what was lost. The survivor always returns near the end of these stories, and I think that is fitting. A drowned world is difficult to imagine for very long without one living figure to carry it across the break. Landscapes can vanish. Cities can sink into mud or salt or silt. Councils of gods can withdraw behind theology. Even islands bright as Dilmun can become names more than places. But one survivor, one person warned in time, one keeper of a memory too heavy for the ordinary world. That is how catastrophe remains human enough to be told. In Mesopotamia, that figure is Ziusudra, or in later related traditions, Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim. The names change slightly. The vessel changes slightly. The surrounding texture changes, but the role remains almost painfully constant. He is the bridge. He is the thin human line stretched between a lost order and the world that follows it. Imagine the first morning after the waters. Not the dramatic version with thunder still rolling and mountains splitting in the distance. The quieter one. The one more likely to stay with a person forever. The rain has stopped. The vessel rocks only a little now. The air smells washed, raw, as if the whole world has been scrubbed too hard. Wood creaks under shrinking ropes and swollen joints. A man, exhausted beyond any speech that would deserve the name, places one hand on the frame of an opening and pushes it wider. Light enters. Not warm yet. Just present. He looks out and sees not his world restored, but the terrible fact that his world is gone. That is where memory begins in earnest. Not while the flood is happening, but in the stillness after it, when the survivor understands that what he carries is not just life, but continuity. The old texts make this survivorship feel ceremonial. Ziusudra is warned because a god refuses total erasure. A vessel is built with care. The flood comes as judgment, or policy, or divine correction, depending on how one leans into the mood of the account. Then sacrifice is offered when the waters withdraw. The gods gather near the offering. Terms are renegotiated. Human life continues, but not as before. That last point matters enormously. The flood in Mesopotamian memory is never just destruction. It is the dividing line between two kinds of world. Before, closer divine governance, longer ages, more direct inheritance. After, diminished continuation, preserved knowledge, restored kingship in a reduced condition. That is why the survivor matters so much. He is not merely lucky. He is archival. Honestly, I have always loved that idea. The first archive after the flood is a human being who remembers what the lost world felt like. Now bring Plato back into the room. His version of cultural survival is quieter, more priestly, more text-based, but structurally it is performing the same miracle. In the dialogues, Solon hears from Egyptian priests that the Greeks are children in matters of old disaster, that their memories are repeatedly wiped clean by catastrophes, while Egypt preserves records in temples. Atlantis enters the Greek world not because someone sailed there and returned with maps, but because priests preserve a chain of memory older than the listeners receiving it. That is exactly the same kind of bridge Ziusudra represents in another register. A later civilization standing on the far side of ruin hears about the older world through a custodian. You know that feeling when a story becomes more trustworthy, not because it is simple, but because the people telling it are already aware of how fragile memory is. That is what I hear in both traditions. The Sumerian flood survivor knows a world has been lost. Plato's Egyptian priests know civilizations forget. The preservation of the lost world is therefore never casual. It is labor, ritual, transmission. The old truth must be carried or it will disappear under the next layer of history. Picture the Egyptian temple archive now, if only for a moment. Stone corridors cooler than the air outside. Lamplight moving softly against carved surfaces. Linen garments brushing the floor. A priest unrolling something old, or reciting from something older than the copy in front of him, explaining to an eager Greek visitor that there have been many destructions of mankind, by fire and by water, and that your people remember only the latest fragments because catastrophe has broken the chain too many times. It is such a calm scene for such a devastating claim. Your civilization is forgetful, the priest says, not because it is foolish, but because the world destroys memory as efficiently as it destroys walls. That observation belongs in Mesopotamia as much as in Egypt. The flood hero survives. The 5 cities do not. The antediluvian order is remembered. It is not recoverable. The Anunnaki remain in theology and liturgy. They do not walk back into history to explain themselves. The old world persists only as transmitted structure. A king list. A flood tablet. A temple name. A myth of paradise island brightness. A hidden freshwater deep. Each is only a fragment. Together they create pressure. This is why the silence in the texts matters so much. The source we are following is wise not to ignore it. No Sumerian tablet says plainly, Atlantis was this drowned Gulf civilization. No Egyptian text preserved through Plato says, we are now speaking about the same old flood memory as the Sumerians. The silence is real. It must be respected. And yet silence in ancient records is not always refutation. Sometimes it is simply what remains after libraries burn, coastlines shift, and oral traditions harden into separate forms in different regions. Some scholars argue that independent invention is enough to explain the parallel. Floods are common. Lost golden ages are common. Divine punishments are common. Fair enough. Human beings do repeat certain narrative structures because they live under similar skies and suffer under similar conditions. Other scholars lean toward cultural memory of real environmental catastrophe. That seems stronger to me, especially when we return to the post-glacial flooding of the Gulf Basin and the wider Mediterranean world. Then there is the third possibility, the one the source most clearly prefers, that both traditions preserve a deeper, inherited memory of a real pre-catastrophe world whose details no later culture retained fully, but whose emotional and structural burden remained. We cannot be sure. That phrase belongs here like a candle belongs in a dark archive. We cannot be sure, but we can watch the patterns gather. 5 cities before the flood. 10 kings of Atlantis. Divine governance. A sophisticated order earlier than the visible present. Catastrophic inundation. Survival through chosen lines. Later priestly or scribal transmission. A bright island of memory. A hidden water source of wisdom. A city like Eridu, standing at the edge of a drowned basin as though the first urban world had inherited its title from something older already gone. None of this forces certainty. It does create a remarkable field of resonance. I think the most honest way to approach it is to imagine memory itself under pressure. A community loses land to water over generations. older centers vanish. Sacred high places become islands. Skills of water management and social order become disproportionately precious. Survivors settle at the new margins. The trauma compresses in oral tradition. Over centuries, it becomes flood myth, divine judgment, paradise island, first city, first kings, lost world. Another culture, farther west, preserves a parallel memory through its own priestly chain. It speaks instead of Atlantis. Both are no longer reports. They are curated grief. That phrase may sound too modern, but I think it fits. Curated grief. Ancient civilizations were very good at preserving pain in beautiful forms. If you were standing here with me by the fire, I think I would say that the survivor is the most important figure in the whole story because he keeps the argument human. Without Ziusudra, the flood is only geology plus theology. With him, it becomes inheritance. Someone saw the old world. Someone remembered it long enough for names and structures to survive. Someone told the next generation that kingship had existed before them. That order was older than their city. That the world they inhabited came after a break. And perhaps that is why the old stories feel so heavy even now. They do not flatter us with beginning. They place us after the flood, after the old order, after the brightest island, after the cities beneath the water, after the divine closeness that later ages had to translate into ritual and law because it no longer walked openly among them. The tablet in the museum basement carries exactly that burden. Burned, broken, catalogued, shelved, studied, and yet still somehow alive with the sensation of something trying to reach across a very long distance. I imagine the scribe who copied it long before the library fire, knowing that he was preserving more than a story. He was preserving the knowledge that history had already drowned once. That alone would make a civilization careful, melancholic, obsessed with continuity. Soon we have to gather all of this into the final stillness. The tablet, the drowned gulf, Eridu, the Anunnaki as divine custodians, the 5 cities, Dilmun, the Abzu, the survivor, Plato's Egyptian priests, the silence that remains between traditions. We have to ask, not for a final sensational answer, but for the calmest possibly conclusion. What, exactly, are these stories remembering? And perhaps more haunting still, what has the water kept for itself? At the end of a story like this, certainty becomes almost vulgar. That is the temptation we have to resist now. The old world does not hand itself over cleanly. It leaves us mud, clay, islands, damaged texts, repeated structures, geological hints, sacred names, and a feeling that something very large is missing just beyond the reach of the surviving record. If we ask too quickly for a verdict, we flatten the mystery into noise. Better, I think, to do what the best archivists do. Lay the fragments out carefully. Let them remain themselves. Then look at the pattern they make when the room goes quiet. We began with a tablet in a basement, one of those strangely humble modern settings where the oldest memories often end up waiting. On it, a flood. Before the flood, cities, Before the flood, divine closeness, a chosen survivor. After the flood, continuation without restoration. It is one of the oldest narrative spines human civilization preserved, and it already carries the core mood of everything that followed. The present is not the first world. It is the world after interruption. Then we widened into geology, and the story grew heavier because the drowned world stopped being purely symbolic. The Persian Gulf Basin really was once land. Rivers really did run across what is now seabed. Sea levels really did rise. Communities at the margins of that transformation almost certainly watched their world alter beyond repair. The gap between myth and landscape narrowed. Not closed. Narrowed. Enough to make the old flood memory feel less like invention and more like compression. From there we stood at Eridu, the first city in memory, though perhaps only the first city after catastrophe had already taught memory how to speak. Marsh edge, hidden water, Enki's temple. The sense that the first surviving center of order may already have been living on inherited sacred geography. Then came the Anunnaki, not as modern spectacle, but as the old divine council of higher governance, the prior order under which kingship and civilization first took shape. Their presence gave the pre-flood world its constitutional seriousness. The old world was not chaotic. It was administered. Then the 5 cities emerged from the king list. 5 names before the deluge. 8 kings with impossible reigns. Dry numbers in clay columns. A flood line dividing eras. It is hard to overstate how eerie that list remains. It does not sing. It records. That restraint is what gives it force. Later, Dilmun opened in brightness. An island of purity, survival, and sacred memory, perhaps a historical Gulf center carrying the halo of a much older paradise landscape. Then the Abzu deepened the picture again. Hidden fresh water, hidden wisdom, hidden hydraulic competence, the deep source from which civilization believes its own viability arises. All of those strands lead back to one basic possibility: that the Mesopotamian world remembered not only a flood, but a pre-flood order tied intimately to water mastery, divine governance, and a geography later drowned or transformed beyond direct recovery. Plato's Atlantis enters that pattern from another direction. A sophisticated island civilization. God-descended rulership, ordered law, great hydraulic design, sudden destruction by water, preservation of the story through later priestly records. It is not the same tradition in surface terms. The names differ. The theology differs. The literary framing differs. Yet the emotional and structural resemblance is profound. Both traditions remember a lost world that was more complete than the present. Both preserve it through mediated memory, rather than direct historical access. Both use water as the agent of rupture between then and now. Some scholars will always prefer independent invention. Perhaps they are right. Floods recur. Human beings mourn lost golden ages. Priests everywhere enjoy telling later generations that they have forgotten what the ancients once knew. There is real explanatory power in that. Others will argue for environmental memory, for the way real post-glacial flooding could generate long-lived traditions, later elaborated into myth. I think that is stronger. Then there is the third possibility, and it is the one that leaves the longest aftertaste. That both the Anunnaki tradition and Atlantis preserve, each in its own style, pieces of a deeper civilizational memory of a drowned world whose physical body was lost, but whose structure survived in story. We cannot prove that in the strictest sense. The source never truly does, and it should not pretend to. But we can say something meaningful and careful. The relationship between the Anunnaki and Atlantis is not literal identity in the surviving texts. It is structural kinship. Both point toward a prior order. Both place that order near divine authority. Both let water destroy the visible world while preserving fragments of its meaning through survivors, priests, and scribes. That is not a small overlap. It is the kind of overlap that deserves to be sat beside rather than rushed past. You know that feeling when two old songs from different languages seem to lean toward the same melody even though neither one can fully hear the other? That is what these traditions feel like to me. The Sumerian flood tablet, Plato's Egyptian memory of Atlantis, the first city at the marsh edge, the island of Dilmun, the hidden Abzu, the long antediluvian rains, different songs, same undertow. I think the silence in the record becomes less frustrating if we remember what water does. It removes archives. It removes coastlines. It removes the ordinary places where continuity likes to live. Once a landscape has gone under, what remains must survive in ritual, in theology, in list form, in the strangely durable emotional habits of a civilization. That is why the old stories are both clear and incomplete. They tell us that there was a before. They tell us that it ended in water. They tell us that knowledge survived in fragments. They do not tell us everything, because perhaps there was no everything left to tell. If you were standing here with me in that museum basement one last time, with the box open and the clay fragment before us, I think the strongest sensation would not be triumph. It would be tenderness. Such a small object. Such a large absence behind it. The edges broken. The text incomplete. The world it describes no longer reachable except through marks pressed by a scribe long dead, preserving a story already ancient to him. There is something almost unbearable in that scale difference. A whole drowned order behind a fragment of clay. And still, the fragment is enough to keep the question alive. That may be the true power of ancient writing. Not that it solves the mystery, but that it prevents the mystery from sinking entirely. The waters remember in their own way. In channels buried below the gulf. In coastlines no longer visible. In island high grounds carrying sacred names. In myths of paradise and catastrophe. In lists of kings too long lived for comfort. In priests telling later people that they have forgotten. In a god of hidden fresh water whose house stands at the edge of a changed world. In all these forms, memory rises again, not as proof exactly, but as pressure against forgetting. So let the ending remain open, because openness is the most honest shape for it. Perhaps the Anunnaki and Atlantis are only parallel myths born from recurring human fears of flood and loss. Perhaps they preserve the memory of real environmental catastrophe without preserving a single shared source. Or perhaps, and this is the most haunting possibility of all, they are two late windows onto the same drowned inheritance, one through Sumerian clay, one through Greek philosophy, both looking back toward a world that stood before our surviving histories began. The fire is lower now. The room is almost still. Somewhere above submerged channels in the Persian Gulf, dark water moves over what may once have been paths, camps, shrines, maybe more. Somewhere in a museum drawer, a flood tablet rests in archival quiet. Somewhere in the long chain of human memory, there remains the conviction that civilization did not begin with us, but arrived to us after a break, carrying the weight of a world already lost. And maybe that is enough for one night. Not certainty, not spectacle, just the old, durable suspicion that water took more than land, and that the first civilizations never stopped trying to tell us so. Good night.